another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. As you know, we are broadcasting internationally, starting with our home base, UPRN, that is United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM in New Orleans, as well as all the affiliates. Not to mention in the UK, another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live program, as you know, in London, broadcasting internationally, starting with our home base, all the different RNs are over United Public Radio Network, 107.7 those terrestrial stations we mentioned. Now, as you know, I myself, Dr. J, am broadcasting from the City of Angels, or City of Demons, depending upon who you ask. Today we have two special guests. The first guest is a true legend, a pioneer, someone who I've literally been paying attention to literally since I've gotten into ufology, 1984. Once you hear his name, folks, if you've been engulfed into this subject, then you know exactly who I'm talking about. And that happens to be the one and only Dr. Bruce Maccabee. Dr. Maccabee, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to know you've been listening to me since 1984. You can help me remember what happened way back then.
I remember seeing you on every major documentary, and I just remember you were one of the true legends. You know, Stanton Friedman, you, there's only a handful of people. Dr. Jacobs, there's not that many people from that era that were talking about this topic, especially in the early 80s when it was very taboo. And now, as you know, it has really surpassed from being taboo into the mainstream, as the network owner, Joe Montaldo, has been on Ancient Aliens in its 10th or 11th season for 3 seasons. That just goes to show you how many people are finally realizing that not only are we not alone, we've never been alone. So now, right, Dr. Maccabee, I'm going to turn this into a more personal question into you. First of all, you were in the Navy and you had a PhD in physics. Did you earn your PhD before the Navy or after?
Oh, well, first of all, I was not in the Navy. I work at a Navy research laboratory. And I started doing that in 1972 after getting a PhD in physics from American University in Washington, D.C.
When did you get involved with UFOs, unidentified flying objects, or as other people call them, flying saucers, UADs, etc.?
Well, of course, I had heard about them when I was a kid in the 50s because they were in the news every now and then, some flyovers in various locations, and there were several flaps, a big flap in 1952, which I've written a whole book about, the legacy of 1952, the year of the UFO. But anyway, I vaguely remember hearing about stuff like that and going to numerous movies that were spaceman type movies of Day the Earth Stood Still, War of the Worlds, It Came from Outer Space, and others were landmark for UFO movies, landmark movies back in the 50s. But I read a book called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, who was the head of Project Blue Book. It was interesting timing because we're now, undergoing the version of history of the Project Blue Book movies being shown on the History Channel every Tuesday night.
That's right. I'm glad you mentioned Project Blue Book because this is something we've spoken about with me and Joe off the air and even on the show, that finally they're addressing Project Blue Book. But as you know, Bruce, it's not a documentary. It's more of a series, a drama series loosely based on the facts.
That's right, very loosely. Now, they actually have real cases, mentioned at least one real case every episode. And they have other events that happen which are patterned to some extent on the actual history, but I've been writing a blog on this after every show. I sit down and write my comments, and you can find that stuff on Facebook. Go to Facebook, Bruce Maccabee, and scan down. You have to go quite a ways down to get the first one. Eventually, if you can scan down far enough, I think you'll get up to 4 blogs on this movie series so far. But anyway, that of course is what's happening now. What was happening way back then that got me interested was in the middle 60s. There were a bunch of sightings, and Project Blue Book, as it always did, tried to explain the various sightings, and they had one particular set of sightings in Hillsdale, Michigan, and asked Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who's the lead character in this new movie series, but the real Dr. J. Allen Hynek, way back in 1966, was asked to go and investigate those sightings and basically to explain them. We would say maybe explain them away, whether the explanation is logical or not. So he studied these sightings and then noticed a bunch of people, a number of the witnesses were looking into a swampy area when they saw these lights moving around in the forest. And it made he had a clue that, well, maybe this was swamp gas. Of course, it was March that this happened, and there wasn't any swamp gas. It was too cold, but that's beside the point. He offered it up as a possibility that there was some marsh gas floating around, glowing. And although years later he said he really didn't believe that, because he said it, and he was the official scientific representative of Project Blue Book, the press ran with it that this was all swamp gas, and he said immediately became Swamp Gas Hynek, which he sort of treasured the name he was given. But anyway, at that time, for a period of time there, well, because of those sightings, Gerald Ford, who was the minority leader of the House at the time, directed the Air Force to hold an independent investigation, not Project Blue Book, but to fund some other agency, presumably at a college or university. And that ended up being at the University of Colorado under Dr. Edward U. Condon. And while this investigation was going on from 1968 to 1969 approximately, it was, for a period of time there, okay to talk about flying saucers and UFOs without having a bag over your head. But then they came in 1969 and said, well, we studied the subject and we published a great big book on it, and Condon wrote that there was nothing, they hadn't found anything that was a threat to the United States. They really actually hadn't found anything. There was no scientific evidence of anything, and the Air Force should get out of it. So the Air Force did get out of it in 1969. Well, by this time, however, I had been sort of hooked on wondering what was really going on here, were they real or not. And I joined an organization called NICAP, the National Investigating Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which is the largest civilian organization at the time with about 10,000 members. And I started doing investigations with the NICAP representatives, and that is what grabbed me when I went to the first case I investigated. The witness was a lady who was a school teacher, I believe, and her husband was an accountant, and she had a strange lights type experience, which we couldn't explain. And it was obviously not because she was drunk or high on something or whatever. She was obviously being as clear as she could in her description of what happened. So it was sort of like generally thought that UFO witnesses are nuts in some way or other, or drunk or something. And these people obviously were not. So I kept on investigating, and I ran into other cases where it was extremely unlikely that they were hoaxing or misidentifying or whatever. And that led to a number of case investigations that I did in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And one of the first ones that I tackled was the only photographic case in the Condon report, which was endorsed by the photographic analyst William Hartman. It was a Trent photo case of May 11th, 1950. And these are probably the photos that have been published more times than any other photos because they're so clear. The image is very large. It's obviously either the real thing or a hoax, some unidentifiable flying craft, or else it's a hoax. And so I cut my teeth on investigation, you might say, on this top level case. No other scientist picked up on the fact that this was published in a supposedly scientific research book, the report on the scientific study of unidentified flying objects was the name of the publication, and it was endorsed by the National Academy of Sciences. And yet, in the book, there is this chapter on the Trent case, in which William Hartman, the photoanalyst, says that all things investigated seem to point to the truth of the claim by the Trents that such an unusual object had flown past them, and they had gotten a couple of pictures of it. You would think that something like that would attract the interest of a whole bunch of scientists if somebody who was a well-known astronomer, as William Hartman was, to come up and say that these things are real. You'd think that a bunch of people would jump on it to either prove that the guy was correct in his analysis or he was wrong. But hardly anybody paid any attention to it, so far as I could tell. Certainly no mainline scientist did, so I took it on, which showed a measure of guts on my part, and I didn't know what I was getting into. If I had known what was going to happen, what I was going to get run into through the years afterwards, I might not have taken it on. But anyway, I did, and you can get my reports on that at my website, brumysite.mysite.com, brumac.mysite.com. Now I'll give that again before we end this conversation.
Absolutely. Just like your Facebook blog near the end of the show, I want you to plug in that. And the 4 books you have, the covers are available on my website. And I also want you to talk about those in detail before we go. Now, you mentioned Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Even though he was infamous for naming or labeling swamp gas, which was the most ludicrous explanation, near the end of his tenure, even after '69, when Project Blue Book ended, he was a very big believer and proponent of extraterrestrials visiting us. He sort of switched roles from what the Air Force wanted him to be, which was debunking them, and actually started to say, wait a second, this evidence here shows that this is non-terrestrial and something and someone is visiting us and watching us. And so that, I think, is one of the greatest things and the misfires that the U.S. Air Force has always had to face. Now, since you got into this in '72 and you had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Hynek before he passed away, what were you able to learn from him on a personal level of what his beliefs were, as far as what he didn't tell us publicly?
Well, I didn't have that many conversations with him, but in September of 1980, there was a UFO symposium debate at the Smithsonian Institution, and Hynek was invited to speak there, and so was I. And they, of course, paid his way there for one night in a hotel. No extra money, shall we say. But he wanted to visit some other people, so he asked if he could stay at my house, and he spent the night. And one of the key things was I asked him something like this: knowing what you know, how do you manage to live a normal life? Or words to that effect. And he said something like this: I sort of pretend that it's not real all the time. So he had a psychological lever to push on it anytime he thought he was going crazy, I guess. He pointed out to many people that his conversion, although he could see that the Air Force and Project Blue Book wasn't being scientific the way they were explaining away sightings any way possible. What I've said is any explanation in a storm, or any explanation is better than none. And if the explanation is proposed doesn't seem to work, you should go ahead and try another one until you've shot the thing down. Well, anyway, he realized that this was not really the scientific method being applied to UFO sightings through the 40s and 50s and into the 60s. But he said the sighting that really began to turn him around, that he couldn't explain, was this Long Island Zamora police officer sighting in Socorro, New Mexico in 1964, I believe that was, where the police officer was completely on the up and up, and there's no chance of a hoax. And the police officer was not drunk or anything like that, so he gave a pretty good description of what he saw. And Hynek visited several times and interviewed him a number of times, and other people did, and couldn't break his story. At that point, he said he began to think that there must be really something going on here. And by the time he had accomplished a complete conversion, by the time Project Blue Book closed in December of 1969, it closed as a result of the report from the Condon study that I mentioned earlier, saying that the Air Force ought to get out of it. So the Air Force closed Project Blue Book in 1969. I'll be interested to see what they do on the TV show about the closing of Project Blue Book, if they're going to continue what happened afterwards. Because what happened afterwards was, in 1973, Hynek founded the Center for UFO Studies, which he said he was founding as an organization to take up where Project Blue Book left off, and collecting sightings and doing analysis and so on. And so the Center for UFO Studies still exists at some level, but it was a major organization in through the 70s, 80s, and the 90s.
You mentioned that case that you were involved in, I believe you said 1972, where a woman had strange lights. How many cases would you say on average that you yourself were the lead investigator on from then until now, unless you've slowed down recently?
Well, I've compared to what I did, I guess I've slowed down recently. But I've never counted up the number of cases that I've been involved in. I probably should have. Most of them end up being explained one way or another. Some of them don't. Like, for example, the Trent case, which I investigated starting in 1974, I believe, and spent several years worth of time investigating various aspects of that. And as I said, you can find that on if you look hard enough on my website. Then I also did a Gemini 11 spacecraft, orbiting spacecraft sighting of some object that went past the Gemini 11 spacecraft in 1966. There was another astronaut sighting that I paid attention to in 1973 Skylab sighting of a red object in space in September of 1973. I vaguely remember a number of cases that I investigated on behalf of this organization called NICAP, which was dying during the 1970s and finally died in 1980. I became the state director for Maryland for MUFON in 1976, I think, and held that position until I moved out of the state. But the cases that you might remember, one of the major case involved in the 70s was the New Zealand sightings off the coast of the South Island of New Zealand, where there were 2 nights, December 20 and 21, and then December 30 and 31, when pilots and crew of freighter aircraft were flying in the middle of the night off the coast of South Island of New Zealand. They had sightings of various lights, and these were picked up by radar on the ground and picked up by radar on the airplane. And there happened to be, which I could go into, but probably won't take the time. There was a news crew on board the plane with 16 millimeter color movie camera and a cameraman and tape recordings. So they had a tape recording on the ground at the radar station, a tape recording on the plane of a reporter who was giving his immediate impressions of what was going on. You had a color movie film, you had radar. What more could you ask for? It's the most documented case, I think, that I'm aware of. And it's the only one that's been argued out in the class refereed technical literature. And a journal called Applied Optics has my calculations of the brightness of the object and some other statements. But anyway, the New Zealand case took up 3 or 4 years worth of time to completely investigate. And there was in 1986 the Japan Airlines case, which has become popular recently because John Callahan, who was the head FAA investigator of the sightings of the Japan Airlines case. Callahan went public 10 years later in the 1990s, and gave this case a boost, but I had already written the largest report on it and published it in the Journal of the Center for UFO Studies that was a case occurred in 1986, and it was published in the June-July issue of 1987, I believe, of the Center for UFO Studies. I got involved with the amazing Gulf Breeze sightings, a series of sightings lasting approximately 10 years, most notably especially known for photos taken by Ed Walters, but there were hundreds of other witnesses as well over the period of several years that the main concentration of sightings took place. I could spend time going through other cases I looked at, but this gives you an idea.
The New Zealand case, let me ask you about that real quick. Was that the one, like you said, it had audio recording from the ground, audio recording from the plane, and color video from the plane? One frame of it, the craft that was being filmed was so fast that it almost looked like it made an infinite symbol. Is that the case you're talking about?
Yeah, that's the ampersand image. It looks like an ampersand character.
Yes.
Almost like the character you see in music, the treble clef character in music.
And that was anyway, one frame. One frame.
But my conclusion was I couldn't prove that it was the object out there. It was more likely that it was the cameraman had bumped. He was standing up, I'm trying to stand up in this crunched down cockpit with a whole bunch of switches and stuff on the ceiling, and he's looking out. You can tell by the motion of the light. Seems to move around a lot, and that's because he's holding it on his shoulder. I think what happened was he bumped the switches up above and caused a very brief, rapid vibration of the lens. But several people have attempted to do that and weren't able to, so I can't guarantee that is the explanation for that ampersand image. If that ampersand image was made by the object, then there's no doubt that it was something that we would find impossible to do.
Especially if these objects are traveling so fast that they're going faster than the speed of sound, yet they do not create sound booms. That thing is shockwaves. That thing is one element that a lot of people fail to recognize. If something is going that fast, then why doesn't it apply, or why don't normal physics that other planes like the SR-71, when it travels faster than the speed of sound, would make that sound boom? Yet this object didn't, and many others didn't. And
well,
also,
we don't know. This is 20 miles off the coast of what? This is 20 miles off the coast of New Zealand. It was in the middle of the night. You could make all the sonic booms you wanted. Nobody would know. They couldn't tell on the inside of the airplane because the engine roar was so voluminous that they had to wear earphones so they could hear each other talking. So I like I said, that's up for grabs. I think my feeling is that it was a vibration of the lens, but I couldn't prove it. So anyway, there are numerous incidents though during that period of time on December 31st, between midnight and 3 a.m. when these sightings occurred. Numerous events that were impossible to have happen. Like for example, the cameraman filmed a flashing blue light. Well, you might say, okay, that's not so unusual, except there were no blue lights, and he was pointing his camera roughly in the direction of Antarctica when that happened. There weren't any blue lights in Antarctica, a couple of thousand miles away, that he could have filmed. Somehow he filmed an impossible light. And then one of the most bizarre events was a radar situation where the plane was flying southward away from Wellington. Wellington, New Zealand was where the radar was. And the radar was watching the airplane flying southward away from it. And seeing these other radar targets, the airplane made a consistent series of blips. Each time the radar sweep came around, it would make a little bright spot on the screen, which was the airplane. And you could see from one scan to the next scan the brightness would be dimming from the scan that was just made, and the new scan would be a bright dot, and then it would start to fade as the scan goes around, and you get another bright dot coming. So you can track a normal aircraft that way. But they're also getting tracks in single events where there would be something on one sweep, there was something there, and then the next sweep there's nothing, and there's nothing anywhere near it. So anyway, they had a situation where the plane was flying south and the radar controller, and I point out this is all on tape, says you got something behind you, and then he says you got something on your right side, and then he says you got something flying in formation with you. Your target has doubled in size. This is like what I call a double-sized target event. That's the only way that could happen would be if you actually had a radar reflector of some sort so close to the plane that the radar sweep couldn't resolve the spacing between these two objects. Now, inside the plane, when the radar guy told them you got something flying in formation with you, this is on the right-hand side, the co-pilot and the news reporter started looking out the right-hand side, and sure enough, they saw a little white light coming along and flashing, and with a green tinge or something, as I recall. There was something there for a short period of time, and then the plane continued its trip south. This object apparently remained stationary, and the plane left it behind after a while. So this series of targets to me says that there's something, not just a random event of a target reflection. I don't know what would have been random anyway at 20 miles off the coast of New Zealand, but it wasn't random. It was more. Well, what I recently realized is they're playing with us, and that's sort of like what was happening. They would zip around to some place near the airplane and sit there for a few seconds, long enough for one sweep to be recorded, and then zip to some other place. So there could have been several of them zipping around doing things. It's a bit more complicated case than I can say on the phone in a few seconds, but this double-sided target, the flashing blue light and the double-sized target events by themselves prove that there was something anomalous going on, and it looked like it was related to some sort of intelligence doing something.
Have you ever investigated any landing cases that have landing trace or any other evidence?
No, although there was in Gulf Breeze there was a case. I didn't investigate it because I lived too far away and wasn't there at the time. But there were a couple of events in Gulf Breeze. One, the grass in a circular area on a high school playing field was killed in, I think, February of 1988 when it was winter time. And this grass circle was apparent even in winter. And one wonders how a grass circle could be created in a schoolyard without people noticing if it was some human being doing it. And then there was another circular area found in some weeds not too far from the beach, as I recall. And that was more like the grass circles that you have been reported in England back in the 80s.
Can you describe for everyone listening the different shapes of some of these various craft that you've seen? And while you're describing shapes, what about the sizes? Because I knew the Japan Airlines from 1986 was fairly large compared to the airplane the pilot was flying.
Well, he compared it to a aircraft carrier.
It's huge.
So that's pretty large.
Yeah.
He drew a picture of this huge object, and he also drew his own Boeing 747 for comparison, and there's about a 4 or 5 to 1 size difference, I guess, in his drawing. I have to say that I don't know for sure that I totally believe what he reported as this gigantic spacecraft. He was the only one who could see it. It was on the left side of the aircraft, and as the pilot on the left-hand side, he was the only one who could see it. But all three of the crew on that flight had previously seen a pair of objects suddenly appear in front of the airplane, one above the other, and it was like that for a couple of minutes, and all of a sudden they switched positions to be side by side for about 10 minutes, or at least some number of minutes. And all three people, all three crew saw that. And so that wasn't a misidentification by the crew. Now, speaking of misidentifications, the NICAP guys, led by Philip J. Klass, who used to be the world's most prominent skeptic, Klass suggested that they had seen Mars and Jupiter sort of side by side in a not too far distant arrangement. And my response to that was, well, you might see Mars and Jupiter and mistake them. They of course, would be points of light, whereas the crew had seen these multiple, what they thought were exhaust ports, or arrays of exhaust ports. You can go to my website and read the case and see the drawings done. But if Mars and Jupiter at one time appeared above the other, they wouldn't suddenly twist to be side by side in a few seconds. It would take months or years for them to shift their positions just like that. So anyway, that blew that explanation out of the woodwork. 20 years later, approximately in November 2006, was the famous O'Hare Airport case.
Oh, yes. Please talk about the O'Hare case, yes.
Speaking of garbage explanations, or the tendency of Project Blue Book and follow on to say any explanation is better than none, or any explanation in a storm, that the O'Hare case involved a number of witnesses who saw this grayish disc-like thing hovering over one of the airport gates. One guy who was moving one of the big jets into a parking area was looking up, and he saw this disc that suddenly took off straight up and punched a hole in the clouds. Apparently, a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times by the name of John Hilkovich was alerted to this event, which occurred in November of 2006. He interviewed a number of people and wrote a story that appeared in a newspaper on early January of 2007, I should say. And there were other witnesses came forward to confirm that there had been this disc-like thing hovering over the airport. And the newspaper said they had asked some expert as to what it might be, and he had claimed that they had been told that it could have been a light. This is at 4:30 in the afternoon, by the way, in November, so it wasn't dark. They were told the explanation was that lights around the airport had reflected in the clouds, and that's what they saw. Well, of course, that had nothing to do. That explanation had nothing to do with the actual sighting.
Exactly. How could a light punch a hole in the clouds? I remember when this happened. This made national news, if not international news, and there were multiple witnesses to this.
That's right. And since the witnesses did not accept the first explanation by the FAA, Federal Aeronautics Administration, the Federal Aeronautics Administration came up with another explanation. They said, "Oh, it was some phenomenon having to do with the clouds," or I forget the exact wording, but it was they just came up with some stupid thing and then left it the way it was. So this is the Air Force effectively carrying on the tradition that had been started back in the late 40s and early 50s. The tradition being that there was nothing to UFOs, and so any explanation remotely could have some possibility of happening is good enough to explain. Nobody's going to pay any attention anyway. I've written all about this in the book called The Legacy of 1952, the year of the UFO.
We have a little over 10 minutes left for the rest of this 1 hour, and I definitely want to bring you back to talk more about these topics and more about your books. And so I'm going to try to focus on a couple questions. One of them being, from when you started investigating yourself, 1972 to now, 2019, what evolution have you seen as far as the public accepting them?
Well, I think there's been a continued increase in acceptance, but it hasn't reached the critical point yet. Everybody's saying, okay, it's real. That's sort of like the emperor has no clothes situation, where a whole bunch of people are walking by. Nobody says anything. They can see what's going on, but they're not saying anything. We're waiting for that one young kid to raise his hand and say, "Mommy, they're real." And then all of a sudden, the major news media and the scientific organizations say, "Oh well, we knew that all along."
And that's the key answer. They're going to say something like you just said, yeah, we knew that all along. And that's the part that they're going to blame us as being stupid. Oh, hey, you didn't know, but we knew this all along. Why do they have this level of secrecy? Do you think this is speculation, of course, Dr. Maccabee. Do you think this is policy from the governments of the world, specifically the United States, telling the news media, hey, you could talk about whatever you want, but when it comes to UFOs or anything that they call fringe, make sure you give this explanation that it could be Earth as opposed to something not originating from Earth?
Well, I don't know that there may have been some direction somewhat like that back in the late 40s and early 50s, but once they had established a tradition that there was nothing to the subject, they didn't really have to exert much effort, any explanation in a story like that. 13,000 cases according to Project Blue Book statistics, 700 of which, or 701 if you want to be exact, they claim they couldn't explain. And you might say, well, look at that. Project Blue Book is telling us there's nothing there and there's 701 cases they couldn't explain. How do you explain that? And the answer is, if you ask Project Blue Book about specific cases of these 701, they say, well, we believe that if we had had more information, we could have explained those cases too. So, in other words, they're saying that those cases fall into a class that we call insufficient information, II, sir. Insufficient information to make a judgment one way or another, whether it really is unknown or not. So they would put those cases into this II category. But guess what? They already had the II category. When they were asked to characterize any particular case, they would come up with cases that definitely had insufficient information to be one way or another. But the ones that were labeled unknown supposedly had something in the case that would prevent them from identifying it. But they would then claim that if they had more information, they could explain whatever was the stumbling block. They would throw the unknowns into the class of insufficient information, which supposedly they had already taken the unknowns out of the class of information in order to get this class called unknowns. Well, the net result is it was an illogical procedure, and that's okay. They would claim ultimately that they explained everything, and the ones they hadn't explained would be explainable if they had more information.
This is the sad part. 701 unexplained or insufficient information cases, yet all we need is one. If just one is proven to be non-terrestrial, then the answer's solved. And yet 701 insufficient information or unexplained, it's almost like they're just trying to brush it away. That doesn't exist. Take a look at these other several thousand that we investigated and proved. But that's not the point. The point is, what about the 701 cases? Now, out of those 701 cases, did any of them stick out to you, even though they were prior to your time, meaning these were from 47 to 69, that you looked at from after the fact that Project Blue Book ended and said, hey, wait a second, this case really sticks out?
So there certainly were Project Blue Book cases that I looked at. One I wrote a book about. The name of the book is 3 Minutes in June, and it's the only book published, it's hard for me to imagine that this is true, but the only book published about the first case, that is Kenneth Arnold, June 24th, 1947. His case lit the fuse, you might say, and yet nobody had really written a definitive analysis of his case. So I took that on a couple of years ago, and I came up and published, not last summer, but the summer before, a book called 3 Minutes in June, the UFO sighting that changed the world. And when you see what I've written, you'll know why I say that. But basically, the whole thing, he saw these objects flying past Mount Rainier, and later, a minute, some seconds later, past Mount Adams, 50 miles south of Mount Rainier. He was able to time how long it took him to go that distance, 50 miles, 102 seconds on his clock, on the dashboard of his clock, of his airplane. He was in an airplane flying at 9,500 feet southwest of Mount Rainier when this happened. He was in a perfect place. He was the right guy at the right time at the right place with the right way. I might say the right way of thinking about something like this. The right attitude. He was in an airplane, so he was able to see them in the air all the way from way north of him to way south of him. Anybody on the ground wouldn't have had that much of a couldn't have seen him for that long a distance. He made measurements to the limits of his ability, compared the angular size of the object with some known object, and basically he made measurements to convince him that he was looking at some new type of jet of the Air Force, and that was his impression. And although he did notice that as they flew along, instead of flying smoothly, they were zipping from side to side and flipping and flashing, to use his terminology, the way it looks if you skip a saucer on the water. And that skipping saucer on the water description of the flight was grabbed by the press and converted to flying saucers, which had nothing to do with the shape of the object, actually. The saucers that Arnold saw, he drew a drawing for the Air Force showing a semicircular on the leading edge and a convex triangle sort of shape on the trailing edge. And there was 9 of them, one of which had a double crescent on the trailing edge. But other people had reported things in the later weeks following his sighting. His sighting was publicized, and that sort of turned on or opened the floodgates, you might say, for other people to report their sightings. And so what developed was a series of sightings that, including sightings by Air Force personnel on duty, and that attracted the attention of the Air Force itself. Of course, this was the weirdness of the phenomenon had been established before the Roswell case. The Roswell case didn't really play a role in ufology, even though it occurred during the first flap in 1947. It was squashed completely by General Ramey and played no further role in the development of UFO studies until 1978. Anyway, Kenneth Arnold's sighting was not the only one in that area. There was a prospector on Mount Adams who was looking for gold, I guess. And he said he saw these things fly overhead, and his compass wobbled back and forth as they were going by. So you have the first sighting being the object seen well enough to give an idea of the shape, the measurement of the speed, which turned out to be about 1,700 miles an hour, the size, maybe 100 and some feet in diameter, and this magnetic effect. All this happened in the first sightings, in the first day, in the first 3 minutes, really. So that's why I named the book. For 3 minutes was all it took for the human race to be given a message that you are not alone.
And 1,700 miles per hour, again, that would have created a sonic boom. And Kenneth Arnold did not report a sonic boom at all, did he?
He was 20 miles away in an airplane. We don't know. But nobody on the ground reported a sonic boom. That's more important. And Fred Johnson, who was the guy, who was the prospector, who saw these things fly southward over his head, just seconds after Kenneth Arnold lost sight of them near Mount Adams, Johnson didn't report a sonic boom either.
Now,
so they know how to get through the air without splitting it.
And one possibility that some researchers say is because they're enveloped in some sort of gravitational field, or they're not even touching the air. There are many theories. I guess it only comes down to when we have access to them, when we can actually go see one, maybe even fly in one. But I don't know when that'll happen. I guess it'll take, first of all, having mainstream public, mainstream media, and governments disclosing the fact and admitting to the fact that this is happening. And for instance, one of the researchers presented saying he wishes upon the day that we can go visit the Roswell wreckage in a museum. Once that happens, I think a lot of questions will be answered. Now, we just got a couple more minutes, so let me ask you this before I ask you to plug in all your information. Now, I've noticed, especially in the last almost 40 years, that the children that are born now, when you ask children in elementary or high school if they believe if we're alone or not, the answer tends to be we're not alone, as opposed to 40 years ago or 35 years ago where it was more fringe. What do you see as far as the future of ufology? Because you've already witnessed a huge change from when you started in 72 to 2019. And again, this is just speculation, but based on that progress, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, eventually they get to the point where when more than 50% of the population are witnesses, somebody will stand up and say, "Hey, it's real," and everybody else will say, "Yep, we agree." Now, what do we do about it?
And
now, I
that's
point out,
just a matter of time.
If you go back and you read the literature back in the late 70s and late 40s and early 50s, you're going to find a lot of similarity between that and what's happening now, except that what's happening now, you're more likely to be able to talk about UFOs and so on without having a bag over your head, as I mentioned in the late 1960s.
Yeah. More people are appearing on TV without having to be blurred faces or hiding their names, because years ago, if you were talking about it, some people would label you as not all there, or having some marbles loose or screws loose, something not right. But now you have credible people seeing things that are incredible, and that's what I think is making the big difference. Dr. Maccabee, I want to thank you so much for this interview. I look forward to having much more time with you on the air. But before you go, I'd like for you to plug in both your blog, your website, and your 4 books, and where people can purchase them.
Well, as I said, you can go to my Facebook site, Bruce Maccabee, and scroll down to where you find a blog, the most recent one being a couple of nights ago. I've written 4 books, one of them called the FBI-CIA UFO Connection, which is basically a history book of the early years, but also my own experiences with the CIA take up the last several chapters. And I think you'll find that very interesting. It's never before been published until this book. Then I wrote a book that involves the abduction phenomenon, but it's a book unlike any other UFO book, maybe like any other book, because it's got a fact book built inside a novel. And you read the fact book right along with the main character in the novel. And when you do that, you see all the reactions of the skeptics and so on. Everything is portrayed in there. Plus, you essentially learn how to do an investigation. You can learn a lot, including philosophy, out of the abduction book. Then I had the 3 Minutes in June book, which is basically proves the Kenneth Arnold sighting was something unusual, and I argue that the way this happened, it could well have been an intentional message that somebody was sending us. And then my most recent one is called The Legacy, 1952, The Legacy of 1952, the year of the UFO, when the Air Force was confronted with a huge flap in sightings in the summer of 1952. And thanks to the FBI, we know that top-level Air Force guys were saying that it could be an interplanetary. I'll be very interested to see what this Project Blue Book movie does with the August press conference by General John A. Sanford, where he was telling the general press that as far as he was concerned, it was all natural phenomena, while at the same time, FBI was being told that top-level Air Force people seriously were considering the interplanetary explanation. And if they had said that at the press conference, the whole history of the subject would have been different. But basically what's happened is, in 1952, they completely established a tradition now. The tradition doesn't need explanation, it's a tradition. But there's nothing to UFOs, and so you use any explanation you want to get rid of a UFO case. That's all clearly explained, I think. A guy who recently read the book said I had nailed it. It was the best book he'd ever read on the subject.
Well said. Again, everybody, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, he told you his website. Make sure you check out his blog, talking especially about History Channel's Project Blue Book, as well as all four of his books. Again, I want to thank you. Everybody stay tuned for the second guest, which happens to be the one and only Sean Stone. Dr. Maccabee, thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, Sean, any message?
At the tone, please record your message. When you have finished recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
Oh, hang on a second, folks. We are going to bring in Sean again. We have a backup number for him here, so sit tight, don't worry. And it is coming right now. Don't worry, folks. Sean Stone, Oliver Stone's son, is joining us right now. And yes, he'll be right here. He's actually a host on RT Russia Today. So,
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah, hang tight. Yeah, Russia Today, watching the Hawks. And he's working on a documentary and all sorts of stuff.
Let's drop him in your diary.
All right.
If you are satisfied with your message, press 1 to listen to your message. Press 2 to erase and re-record. Press 3 to continue recording where you left off. Press 4.
If you can drop that, Joe, if we can, there we go. And we are going here. Everybody, like I said, stay tuned. This is the first time we've had 2 guests on this show. And yeah, that's why we're bringing you 2 guests on this 2 very special hours. He is a return guest. He's been on the show several times, going back to, I don't want to say 7 years when the show began, but at least 6 years. And like I said, he'll be right here to this phone call, and he'll be joining us very soon. We did speak to him right before we went on air with Dr. Bruce Maccabee, and he is standing by. Let's see here if we can get him again, and we are going strong. And if you want to see more of his bio, folks, I recommend you checking out drjradiolive.com, drjradiolive.com, and you can see all about Sean Stone and his work. He's been involved in several of his movies, both producing, directing, and even acting. And like I said, he's involved with Russia Today, which is a very, very big deal. One of the largest media channels that has grown from, some people used to say independent, but one of the more reliable sources right now. And that's what many of us aim to seek to be. And it's great that he's able to rise to that occasion. I remember before he started working on for RT, Sean was just a great person, and he was making the rounds at different events such as Conscious Life Expo and certain things like that. Sean, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Sean Stone, everybody. We finally brought you on. We apologize. We dialed the wrong number. We believe we left you a voicemail of the line. That's okay. I was just giving people some background of yourself, talking about how you work for Russia Today, Watching the Hawks. You host that show, and you've also produced, directed, and starred in some movies. You want to talk about those movies real quick?
Sure. I mean, I've done quite a few both documentaries and features. One feature is called Greystone Park. It's a horror based on my experiences ghost hunting in places in the East Coast, real places like in New Jersey, these haunted mental hospitals that we used to go and break into and basically, hang out in as we were researching these stories. So Greystone Park was the first one I did. Fury of the Fist is the most recent film I produced and acted in. It's a martial arts comedy featuring Michael Dudikoff, Bill Goldberg, Tiny Lister, you name it, Danny Trejo, like a huge cast of actors, and that's a lot of fun. It's available. So both are available to watch, and then a few documentaries I've done over the years, and most recently, A Century of War is one that's available on Amazon. It's about the deindustrialization of America. Hollywood DC is online on YouTube about the relationship of Washington politics and Hollywood, and then there is the upcoming Meta-Human that's coming out on RT very, very soon.
And I'm glad you actually brought that up because that segues into what I was going to talk about, Meta-Human. Before we went on the show, before we started with our first hour guest, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, when I called you, and you mentioned Meta-Human and certain topics of it, and really that aroused me in several ways because, first of all, you're talking about Deepak Chopra, right?
Yeah, we interviewed Deepak, and Deepak basically is sort of he's our main character in Meta-Human. He really is our guide and our between myself, the conversations that we have pretty much guide the story that we unfold, which is what is it to be human? What is it? What is this experience except just a human experience of consciousness while humanity is changing, as it always has changed over time through the nature of evolution, whether you believe in the spiritual form of evolution or just Darwinian evolution. The point is that we've constantly changed and transformed, and we will continue to do so, especially into the century, which is going to be so full of, you name it, human design, re-engineering of DNA, entering virtual realms, potentially cloning. I mean, there's so many issues of consciousness that are coming up now as we go forward.
I'm glad you mentioned consciousness and AI because those two are big topics. A lot of people are looking into the question of what is consciousness and how deep can we go as far as exploring it. And then a whole separate topic is AI, and some people are even merging the two. Now, as far as consciousness, for the people who haven't paid much attention to it, if you could give a general explanation or definition for it, what would you say it is?
Consciousness, some people could say that it is the nature of God itself, because consciousness, to the argument that we make in the story, that I think Deepak would be one of the great proponents of this point, that consciousness, essentially all that is consciousness. Basically, there's this infinite consciousness, and there are different degrees and different bandwidths of receiving consciousness, but essentially consciousness is the force. It permeates existence. It's what gives meaning to life. It's what basically it's the spirit basically that imbues all things is consciousness. So whether or not you could say that there's lesser levels of consciousness, which are basically rocks and inanimate objects, but they still are they're still part of the experience of consciousness, right? We don't know if they have any level of consciousness in the future. Maybe a rock will evolve into into the molecules of a human in some form. It'll impart itself to the human. But the point being that everything is essentially part of the experience of consciousness. But where does it begin or end? That is the question. That is the alpha and omega. No one can quite answer, right?
Very, very good answer, Sean. And that's a much deeper philosophical answer than a lot of people would understand. And I've noticed more so in the late 20th and 21st century that people started to pay attention to consciousness, especially when you said when you mentioned it with God. If you were talking about this 100 years ago, people would probably write this off as fringe and sort of things like that. But consciousness, like you said, is not just a connection to our God, but it's ourselves, our inner selves. Wouldn't you agree to that?
It's certainly, well, it's not just, yeah, I mean, as you say, it's not just our, look, all we can speak of when it comes to reality is our perception, right? I mean, that's the beauty of this reality, is that we talk about it in fact, what is real, what is reality, what is, everything is based in I can only speak from my perspective. Even if I'm outside of myself, I'm still looking from my perception of consciousness, right? My perception, my reality, even though consciousness is unlimited, and potentially there are ways of sharing. We have different, expensive drugs that take us out of our normal realms of perception, right? And potentially the consciousness could be shared to the place where maybe I could even walk into your being and see through your eyes. It's still me. There's still behind it. Everything is me, Sean Stone, this being which is even behind Sean Stone, right? Before Sean Stone was given a name, there was something. And after Sean Stone dies, there will be something. And that is what I'm saying is the true essence of me, my perspective, my reality. But it's not to say that is all that is. That is not all the consciousness that exists, but it is some sliver of consciousness. It is some aspect of a much greater being, not being, just essence, being as in something that exists.
I'm going to break off from our conversation real quick, Sean, to ask two questions that are literally in the chat room for you. One of them, it says, what's Sean's take on the 441, if you understand what that is? And the second is, does Sean find the New World Order a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I've written a book on the New World Order called New World Order, and it's trying to sort of diagram the essence of what the New World Order is, as far as a continuation of the British imperial policy, which really is just a continuation of empire going back to Rome and Venice and Babylon. And essentially this policy was meant to, there's basically two factions. One is the imperialist faction, the other is the Republican nationalist faction. That's, you could say, is the Republican faction finds itself advocating for nation states, but it doesn't have to be. It could be communities, it could be local, but the idea is ultimately it's humanistic. It says the human groups have to have sovereignty over themselves. We have to basically have more relationships to each other and not be ruled by these overarching structures that have been put into place, right? The reality of our world right now is a white man's making. It's a rule of empires, of laws, of legal structures, of grids, and other things that basically are told that are for our benefit, and yet for the most part, we are ignorant of how things actually work, the technologies that are available to us, whether it's from the future propulsion systems that are already available to, the nature of money being controlled by a central bank. I mean, all these are imperial legal structures that were put into effect that is basically the New World Order essence. And what we oppose to that is the humanistic force that believes that people have rights to information, to have free access to markets, to disclose ideas, to basically, invent new things to challenge these overarching structures. So I'm opposed to that old form of New World Order. I do think that humans across the globe can come together because we all share fundamental traits of how we want to live our lives, emotional, and based in emotion, based in curiosity, based in humanism. So there are futures where the New World Order can basically be overturned, and we can still have a global society, but you ultimately have to have republics. You have to have people operating basically who are responsible and answerable to each other, and not just to these great overarching imperial systems. So that's my response to the New World Order question.
I think when it comes to terms of our civilization and other civilizations, then New World Order is a great thing because we no longer look at us as, say, Americans or Europeans or Africans or Asians. We'd look at ourselves as humans. But at the same time, the way our nature is, we have to worry about the oligarchs controlling us and deciding what's best for each of us, as opposed to each human being have input for the entire human race. And there's arguments that really could be made on both sides. Sean, there are still more questions here for you. Let's see here.
The 441, by the way, I don't know what that is. I'd love to know more about the 441, so I can't answer that.
I'm going to actually go ahead and ask that question here while to the people who are writing this question. This is another question here. What's Sean's and RT's take on Brexit?
Honestly, I don't know RT's take on it. I don't know if there's there's no, as far as I know, there's no government policy, behind RT. RT basically has a bunch of journalists, and they come from different political leanings. They're all Americans, or at least mostly Americans. So RT America, that is, RT and has other branches all over the world. So as far as RT America's, take, I think you have to watch the news and just see what their reporters say, and you get their perspective. My perspective on Brexit is I'm pretty much agnostic on it, because I'm very much aware of the British imperial system of power, and the British are basically one of the great architects of the Euro, the European Union, in the first place, which on one hand, I favor the idea of customs unions and the idea of trade agreements, but I don't like the overarching concept of what the EU is and the central bank behind it, and the fact that they've consolidated this monetary empire, much to the detriment of the peoples of Southern Europe, as we've seen, from Greece and Italy and Spain, and obviously EU for the most part is run from Germany. So some people would argue that it basically was a continuation of Hitler's, new order. Basically, it was a new order for Europe to be controlled basically like this from Germany, and it's been done in a much more maybe pacifist way than what Hitler was conceiving, but very much along similar legal terms.
Now, I did pose that question in a chat about 441, and I got the answer, Sean, but it definitely applies to another guest. It applies more to David Paulides, but I guess I have to ask it to you because this person is asking me to ask Mr. Stone. It is, what is 411, meaning the missing people in the United States for missing 411, David Paulides? Do you know anything about that?
Oh, the missing people?
Yes, that's what he's asking.
I mean, I've only, I'm as curious about it as anyone else. I've heard any number of numbers on it, anywhere from hundreds of thousands of missing, children and people every year, from hundreds of thousands to, I've heard sometimes a million or two. But it could be a number of things. I mean, certainly you have human trafficking is a major issue that, I like to advocate against as much as possible, make people aware about. Anytime you're engaging with certain economies that are based in slavery, right? Like, not paying people for wages, or even, prostitution, things like this, then basically that's what's allowing this black market of human trafficking to exist. But beyond that, there is I think, a fact of underground bases. There is a fact of secret space program activity, potentially even colonization of our other planets and our star system. So you have to be open to the possibility that some people that disappear do get taken to these underground civilizations, let's call them.
And as you mentioned, human trafficking, that is a huge problem that I don't think gets enough coverage. And sadly, it happens to a lot of children who end up being, say, slaves or sex slaves, or sometimes they're experimented on in horrific ways, which is why I think some of the mainstream media does not want to touch on. It's very, very sad. Okay, this is not unfortunately, Sean. This is good. This is definitely good. There's a lot of people that have questions here for you. So
cool.
Instead of me and you conversing back and forth, I'm just going to go down the list and see what else I find here for you.
Get some fun nuggets.
Yeah. I hope this is spelled correctly, but it says, what does he think of the questions at Davos this week? DAVOS. Do you know what that means?
Yeah, Davos, in terms of the World Economic Forum. I honestly am not following the latest political stuff. I've heard that Trump is pretty much at odds with a lot of his advisors, which reinforces, my trust that he's actually doing a lot of good stuff. He's basically really working at odds with the deep state agenda, despite what the mainstream media would have you believe. Or I guess maybe that is the point. The mainstream media is the biggest advocate of the deep state, right? Of the permanent bureaucracy of CIA and FBI and these guys that are basically lackeys of much greater power oligarchs you mentioned earlier, much greater power structures like the financial institutions and the you name it, like big pharma, insurance, weapons. I mean, at a certain point, there's an interlocking of vested interests that make profit from fear, whether it be disease, war, debt. These are three great things that people fear in the course of their life, right? And so there's a huge industry that we know oligarchs that have made profit from the existence of those things. So I think that Trump is at odds with this deeper agenda of the New World Order to perpetuate basically what they want is, a globalized, again, I'm for globalization in certain aspects of humanity coming together. There has, we have common cause with people across the world. So it's like at one level, the governments of the world will play out this fake drama of being opposed to each other, when in reality, the people of the world are coming together more and more, recognizing their common humanity, their common interests, the shared interest of trade and agreements, basically whereby we basically expand our markets and our economies using crypto and other currencies, blockchain technologies, anything that can take us off of the grid of a centralized banking system that tells you how much money should be in circulation at any moment. So when it comes to Davos, I have no say on what they're actually talking about or what's going on there, but I just like what Trump has been up to recently as far as challenging a lot of these institutions.
I got to tell you, Sean, I'm very impressed with your answer because I've been a big supporter of Donald Trump, even vocally on this show. Of course, when I have a Democrat who is a politician, I don't mention how much of a supporter of Trump I am. But when people like Roger Stone or Jerome Corsi come on, it's pretty evident that I'm wearing a Make America Great Again hat. He is absolutely anti-deep state. And like you mentioned, the FBI, CIA, all those deep state players obviously want him out of office. I mean, for instance, the very first day I think it was just a couple weeks ago or last month when Brad Sherman and the lower house was taken back by the Democrats, they introduced articles of impeachment. Impeach him for what? That's the craziest part. It just drives me nuts. Okay, let's see what else I got here for you. This is Ask Sean.
2012, by the way. Before you go to that, but in 2012, we did a video that I released on Alex Jones' platform. It was called Impeach Obama 2012. And we got into the whole thing about going to war illegally with Libya. We got into the issue of basically how he bailed the banks out when he came into office in 2008, and he did nothing to protect the homeowners. There were a few other charges, but the illegal assassination programs he was running, where he killed an American citizen, who's and his son, because basically he had these executive orders, just said I can by executive decree I can assassinate someone because he's a terrorist. Right? I mean, these are the kind of things that Obama was doing that were publicly known. So he said, why aren't you impeaching this guy?
and you made a good point, Sean. This is what the public was aware about, right? What about what's not aware about? This is one argument I always make. For instance, not too long ago, I had a former CIA interrogator on, and I asked him this. If we know what's happening, for instance, on the United States soil at Florence 80X Supermax prison, if we know what's going on in that prison, and we also know about waterboarding going on at Guantanamo Bay, what the heck is going on at CIA black sites around the world? I mean, if you could only imagine what we're not told about, I think people would cringe at that. And that's a very good point when you mentioned public versus private, because there's two sides to the coin. Okay, another question for you, Sean. Ask Sean if he's going to take the microchip.
Take the microchip? In which orifice?
So no, it's just that's the whole question.
The microchip. No, this is an interesting thing we get into, by the way, in the MetaHuman document. Right, we get into this whole question of chipping humans. Can we put your brain on a computer? Can we back up your brain? Basically, can we reverse engineer it, turn it into a bunch of data chips, and put that data onto a computer? Well, I don't know about you. I don't believe it.
And honestly, you're absolutely right. I don't know who would want to personally take it. I know on the media, they've shown people who voluntarily say, oh, yes, I had this microchip implanted in my child because in case they are missing, I could find them and things like that. Well, that's what you're told. What about the things you're not told about? For instance, what it causes, what it affects, how it affects your nervous system, different things like that. Okay, here's just a comment. Crypto has...
the 5G EMFs, right? How powerful that is in terms of they're putting 5G EMF everywhere. And, it's damaging the systems. I mean, we think that it seems like the indication is that it's actually like harming birds, for example, right? So if it's affecting the birds, it's affecting their ability to move, not to actually kill them from the frequency. How is it damaging our own systems, right? We already know that these electromagnetic frequency is very powerful from these cell phones and computers and other things, but to go to 5G seems unnecessary. It seems more like a way of basically trying to convert us, to roboticize us, essentially, right? To move us into a place where either we die quicker or we have to resort to their medication, to their system of upgrading ourselves through transhuman agendas, which is basically including more and more chipping robotics into the human being to survive, right? The Darth Vader. Essentially, that's the way I prescribe to people. I say, listen, do you want to end up as Darth Vader? Do you want to basically lose your humanity and preserve yourself in the robotic form and call yourself, a human? Is that what you want to be? And that's really where they're taking us. So the idea of chipping to me is not appealing. There is a possibility of chipping, for data, but I don't believe fundamentally they can ever take the consciousness or the soul and put it into a chip. I think they run into a fundamental problem there. That's my argument with the AI guys. I think that consciousness is something that can't be quantified that way, right? And this is where the issue we talked about at the beginning was consciousness. Can you actually quantify consciousness? Can you actually boil it down to ones and zeros or digital codes? Or is it something that's more like, how do you say, it's a higher level of science and frequency than we can even begin to fathom, right? It's almost, because it's lifelike. It's more of a genetic. So it basically is, it's mutating on its own. You're reacting with it. It's moving with you. You cannot just ever lock it down. The same way that quantum physics tells us, we can't ever exactly perceive something, because it's always going to be a little bit more sneaky because we're aware of it than if there was no consciousness or no observer of the event.
It's ironic. You literally started talking about 5G as a question came about to say, what about the new 5G? What's his take? And you just mentioned it. Okay, there's a couple more here. Let's see. Is it connected to HARP?
Interesting. It could be. I never thought. I honestly haven't thought too deeply on what they're doing with HARP, because we know that they achieved something with HARP to the place where they technically shut it down from public knowledge. Right? There's apparently HARP was put to bed, meaning that they achieved what they were looking for, and who knows what they're using that technology for at this point. So it could very well be tied to it.
Here is something else. How does he feel about recent head transplants? I don't know if you get that question.
Wait, recent head transplants?
Head transplant.
This guy wants to transplant his head, right?
Ooh.
Well, how did you look?
I have no idea. Honestly, I have no idea.
I mean, I honestly don't know. I'd have to hear more about what actually occurred and how, shoot. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what that would be like. Talk about consciousness, because I believe that consciousness is tied integrally. Your consciousness, at least, is tied to your body, right? There are portals. There's energy. The Chinese and the Eastern masters call it chi, in Hinduism it's prana. But there's this life force energy that imbues us, and it's more than just the air we breathe. And this life force energy that imbues us would seem to have certain vessels of operation through the body. So I don't know how it quite works that you can have the same experience of reality, the same potential in a different body if you move your head from one being to another. Plus, the question arises, well, how does that work on a DNA level? Like, your DNA, I don't quite understand how that, so you're basically mixing your DNA with someone else's DNA? Because that body has someone else's DNA, right, in your head.
How would that be possible in my mind? I mean, I'm not a medicine doctor. I don't practice, anything of that sort, anatomy. So I couldn't see how one person's DNA fits another. Even just in blood transfusions, right? You have to have a certain type of blood just to match your own if you were to receive a blood transfusion, let alone DNA. Would the head even survive? Would the skin die? There's all those questions that need far more explanation.
Well, apparently, I mean, again, I did hear about this, that they are moving somebody who wants to do the head transplant. I just don't know what's actually happened, what are the results. That's something you have to study in itself, and it'd be fascinating if it's successful, what the person then experiences in this new body.
I hope I don't mispronounce this word. It says, this is more of a statement. It says, we are going from Kali Yuga to Bronze Age. What do you think of that? Do you know what that means?
Yeah. Kali Yuga basically is the worst. It's like hell in the Hindu Vedic tradition. It would be basically the most materialistic age which is why it's been hell. Basically there are beings in hell that feel sorry for humans because what we have been through the last few thousand years of increased materialism to the place that to talk about spiritual life puts you into the category of someone belonging in a psych ward, right? So let's be honest, we're in a very materialistic place, and the exit from Kali Yuga, which is really I think what 2012 was all about, was initiating a new age beyond the Piscean, which is now we're entering the Aquarian age, right? The age of Aquarius.
Yes.
Like the song goes, is very much about going away from the school where basically the Piscean age was the fish. Fish operate in schools. They're basically like herded. The Aquarian age is becoming the water bearers, basically. So we are now out of the water ourselves, we're not the fish, we're now actually carrying the water. So we have much more freedom to move beyond the net. Right, the net that traps the fish. We have much more freedom to move and to become, basically, to have that Christ-like consciousness. That is a new paradigm. The paradigm is not Christ is coming to save us. It's no, Christ consciousness is here and it's accessible to you now. And if you are willing to tap into that, you can upgrade and augment your reality and share it with beings, and basically the light beings will light up and see each other and come together and work together more and more. And who knows where the earth will go? It'll split off into different realities, if there'll be cataclysms and people will die off who aren't ready for what's coming. But I'm very optimistic actually about where we're going. I don't believe that there's a future for humankind the way it is currently designed. The population, the environment cannot sustain the way that it's currently designed. That doesn't mean that we don't have the tools and the technology to solve the problems, but you have to have the consciousness that can actually apply those tools.
The final statement you made was just what I was going to say, that we have to have an introspective alertness to change our consciousness in order to change our ways. Otherwise, not only are we very selfish and destructive, if we are to continue down this path, Sean, I could see how we will easily destroy the planet and its resources. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have so many problems today. And overpopulation, I believe we recently hit 7 billion, or we're about to. At this rate, even though there's plenty of land available, at what point does it become so many people that we can't sustain it for multiple reasons? And then here comes another fundamental question. We breathe oxygen, yet 80% of the air is nitrogen, which we don't even believe. It's poisonous to us. So that also begs even a further question. Do we even belong here? Are we even brought here from things like panspermia? Is this our original home, or were we brought here from somewhere else and are some sort of an experiment? These are all philosophical questions that I'm sure we can spend hours and decades on, for that matter. Here's another question here for you. It says here, What do you think of the fact that it's 2 minutes to doomsday, and it talks about specifically December 21st to December 23rd, 2020?
I hope so. You got to get out of that old paradigm, man. That's just, I'm just, to whoever asked the question, just kind of let go of the old paradigm. The old paradigm that has been basically propounding. Okay, so think about like the biblical teachings, right? I really believe that there were Christ characters, there was Christ consciousness, there were star beings that understood this, wise men and women who basically had the knowledge and the wisdom, and they were imparting it. And I think the Roman Empire was very clever. There's a couple of great books on it. One is called Creating Christ, most recently. And it basically, the Roman emperors of the time said, hey, these Jews are really rabble-rousing. They believe this Messiah is going to come and save them. They don't want to stop fighting and rebelling against our empire. Let's write books telling them that the Savior and Messiah already came, and that will justify the destruction of the temple, right? The second temple of Solomon that was destroyed by the Romans in, 70 AD, I think. And basically, you have this whole history since then of people going around Bible thumping for 2,000 years saying the end is nigh, doomsday is upon us. Well, for the Jews, it already happened. That's why they don't really talk about doomsday as much, because they're like, all right, our doomsday already happened. Other cultures, like the Kali Yuga, it's not doomsday. It's a great day is upon us. So it's just this Christian paradigm that really stuck in this mold of like, doomsday. They've been talking about this for a couple thousand years now. I promise you. They tell you the doomsday was upon you in 1000 AD. They tell you it was upon you in 1900 and 1922 and whatever. Every time the
and what about 666 AD?
You got to get out of that paradigm.
Can you imagine what the Londoners thought in the year 666 AD when London was on fire? I guarantee you they thought it was the end of the world.
1666. Yeah, it was the end. And I'll tell you something. It's the end of the world, people, every day. Every day, how many thousand people die? It's the end of their world. So we got to get out of this mindset. It's an old paradigm. And if you keep believing this stuff, you will live it. And if you don't believe it anymore, you live a different reality. So my reality is, when 2012 came, I was like, great, the new age is upon us. Not the end of the world. No, I never believed that for a second. The end of a world only means the beginning of a new one. So you have to have the mindset that actually we are in the midst of entering this new reality, this new earth. This is what's blossoming. And doomsday, that's no meaning for me. I mean, if you're living in the Amazon and your trees are being cut down, or let's say on the whole earth, our trees are being cut down and those trees are dying, it's the end of the world for those trees that are being cut down. It's the end of the world for any being that's being shut out of life or locked up in a prison today. But that's not my reality. My reality is I believe in life. I believe in extending life and expanding it, and raising consciousness and raising more life. So there is no end. Even when we die, I don't believe it's over anyway. It's opening to a new reality.
And you mentioned another good point, Sean, about what happens after we die. I think, and this is my own belief, that consciousness, our own consciousness, goes with us when we pass away. That some people believe in reincarnation, others believe that there's a heaven or hell, others just believe that we go somewhere else spiritually, that we don't have this physical body. But I believe what we do affects our consciousness to the core and actually carries over into the afterlife. Would you agree with that statement, or what's your take on what happens after we pass away?
Well, I'm fascinated by the traditions in Egypt and Atlantis. Because I believe Egypt was an extension of Atlantis, and the Tibetans actually picked up on Egypt quite well with their books of the dead. The Egyptians and the Buddhists focus on death so much for a reason. It's not because they're just fascinated with dying in oblivion. It's because they actually believe you have to be conscious through death to project yourself into the future. The truth of thousands of years of Atlantean history that was known, that has been intentionally obscured, is that we reincarnate. We do not die. We never die. We go into a new body. It might be in this earth. It might be other dimensions. It might be when the time comes to leave this dimension entirely. But the point is that we reincarnate. And the journey has always been to maintain consciousness as long as possible through the life process and through the dying process, so that we can carry our awareness with us, and we don't die in this, basically being obscured and oblivious, and then reincarnating into a body that has forgotten everything and has to relearn everything and go through the same experiences it went through over and over and over again, right? So
well said.
The trick has been to tell people the opposite and tell them that, when you die, you go to heaven or hell, or when you die, you go nowhere. And that's all just meant to obscure people to the place where they don't realize that they have this tremendous opportunity in death to basically take their consciousness and journey with it into their next existence.
I almost get the impression that those humans that lived, like you said, in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and those civilizations somehow knew more than us. I don't know if it's because of the materialistic ways we live today, or it's just because I couldn't tell you, but that's just my impression. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, Plato did. I mean, the whole story of Greek history was, Plato related it, and I think it related in, I think it was the Republic. I think he talked about, or was it? No, it wasn't the Republic. It was which book? Timaeus and Critias. I think he wrote about Atlantis, and he basically said that the Egyptians look at us as Greeks as children. They say, you guys are such a young peoples, right? And you don't have the traditions and lineage that, the Egyptians had. If you talk to Anthony West, who just passed away, he was a fascinating guy. He talks about how the king books go back 30,000 BC, and probably the Egyptians were Atlanteans before. And they had some remnants of Atlantean civilization in their tradition. So they told the Greeks, you guys are children. You don't really know. And so the Greeks gave rise to this Western civilization. They say, the world that we live in is a white man's world. It's, white people have some of the people I think have this guilt issue about it. Others are very proud, and they're like, no, don't tell me I'm not responsible for it. Well, it's not being responsible and not just recognizing that what we have in this world right now is a world created by Western empires that really were born on the belief and hope and freedom, but actually got obstructed and obscured into this imperial policies that promoted the materialism that, people, in a sense, by believing in freedom, bought into the lie of materialism. So that right now you can see it, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s in the culture of consumerism, right? So it's like, I'm free. I can go buy my Nikes. Okay, well, Nike uses slave labor. How free is that? Right? And so we're living in this complete paradox of reality where people think that they're more free than ever, but they've become so materialistic, they've actually surrendered their freedom, because the true freedom was always the freedom of the spirit. And the freedom of the spirit has to see truth and cannot obscure and lie to itself and say, well, I live in the freest nation in the world, and who gives a damn if we don't pay a worker $1 a day, for this cup of coffee that I drink, and if I pollute gas and all these things, that I'm living basically chopping down trees in the Amazon, who cares? It's not my problem. How is that freedom?
It's not, and it actually goes one step further. Aside from that spiritual freedom, Sean, we know that the more so-called freedom that we get in the United States, we actually have less freedom every time a new law comes around because of so-called terrorism, National Security Act. They restrict that freedom, let alone the inner spiritual freedom. And that's just really sad, where people say, hey, I live in a free country. Well, not so much.
Of course. And I mean, that's one expression of it, right? Is that we live in a hypocritical country. And I think I came to that realization young. My father, watching movies like JFK, studying CIA tactics of overthrowing governments and murdering anyone that opposes them, right? Assassinations and wars. I mean, I learned pretty early, we're pretty hypocritical, and it really bothered me for a long time. But then I came to understand it wasn't just America. It's literally a plague of these empires, basically, of this imperial mindset. And there's I believe there's a dark side that everyone has. And if you don't go inside and do the inner work to find your own, ignorance, the things that you're not willing to look at, the witness parts of you just dismiss and say, it doesn't matter, or, I'll just ignore it, then you are basically still epitomizing and still exemplifying the same shadow, dark side that rules us all. And we each have to do that work. And it's hard. It's very difficult, but it's liberating too, because the more you go into it, the more you find that you can face those shadows and give them light, and you become more whole as a human being and softer and more aware as a being and more sensitive, then actually you're achieving your freedom. And then you can be more your authentic self. And if everyone does this, the entire planet would be transformed overnight.
Sean, I gotta say, you have so much great philosophy. If more people paid attention and listened to the advice you give, and probably from all the experiences and places you visited, you've gained all this insightful information that would make us better humans. Now, we have just under 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure there's a couple minutes for you to plug in all your information. We're still getting questions, so let me see. This is one that's specific to England, and let's see if you could answer it at all. It says, can Sean tell us when we can expect to see the final cut of the British super soldier in the north of England?
Ha! Oh, okay. I did an interview with John Irwin. I think that's online. People can watch it. John Irwin's an interesting guy who basically says he was part of the Black Ops. Yeah, I believe him. I think he was involved back in the 50s. And you can see the interview online, I'm sure, on YouTube. But the film adaptation, we're far from there. I mean, that would be a major motion picture, so those things take time. But yeah, it would be fun to make it.
Now, I'm going to go back to something that I had planned on asking you long before we brought you on, when I first talked to you before the show about metahuman. And you mentioned that the conversations with Deepak Chopra, you talked about consciousness and AI. That's one thing we didn't touch on so far in this interview. And I wanted to ask you real quick, I know this can be literally an entire whole conversation and we are limited on time, but can you tell us what the pros and cons are?
Of what? Of
AI, artificial intelligence. Yeah.
Of AI. Well, philosophically, it's a really long discussion. I think, to me, there is no artificial intelligence. It's kind of like a misnomer, I guess you could say. I think there's machine intelligence, there's augmentations of intelligence, right? Most of what we call intelligence is artificial. Humans operate by artificial intelligence. Why? Because we're taught things that have nothing to do with reality or that are completely false. We create belief systems that are fake, right? It's belief. Be lie. That's what belief is. It's a be a lie. Okay. So a lot of what we call our intelligence is just artificially imposed, believed, adopted, implemented. If you want, we operate on things that these cities are not going to outlast nature. Every one of these cities is eventually going to decay and weather and die. It's an artificial construct, right? Doesn't mean that it doesn't have its purpose. So things have their purpose, and artificial intelligence has its purpose. It's here to help, as far as an extension of human machines, tools. We've always used tools since the beginning of creating fire, creating using workhorses, creating the steam engine. I mean, these are tools that we adapt and we use them for our environment to make our lives easier. I'm all for the use of intelligent machines to do service jobs that we shouldn't have people doing anymore. I believe in that there's an opportunity for a universal income when we recognize, like the Jacques Vallée concept of the Venus Project, that a lot of labor is being expended unnecessarily. And essentially, if you want to talk about slaves, machines would be our slaves, essentially. They would be our tools for doing menial jobs, for taking care of a lot of things that we don't need to do. We can expend a lot less energy doing those things and working less, and hopefully, having more time to entertain ourselves, create, dream, philosophize. You actually end up with a more intelligent society, probably. You think about, like, ancient Greece. They had slaves. We would have, and they had a lot of philosophers and time for thinking, and they created democracy. Well, we would have machines basically doing that work. What the Greeks used slaves for, we would have machines to do. I think there's something to be said for all of that, and the AI is extremely important to that process. There's danger to AI, of course, because humans are designing them, and humans are screwed up. as we know.
Right.
So the same way that you have humans making smart bombs and drones and other things to kill people, they would do the same thing with AI, of course, to design those programs to use killer robots to kill somebody. So that's why I say, like, the AI thing is kind of funny, because it's always a reflection of humanity. Whether or not we're using, we're programming a bomb a drone to blow someone up, or a machine to target people, it's still humans who are programming these things and writing the code. And then, the idea of the AI becoming conscious, I don't really buy it. That's a much bigger discussion, though, because it has to do with consciousness itself. And as I said, I think that the force that imbues consciousness, or whatever, the force that is consciousness, is so much more powerful than what we can quantify in machine learning.
Agreed. And you made a very powerful statement that machines, computers created by humans, have to carry our flaws, whether we want them to or not, because we have flaws innately, then therefore they're carried into them. There are a couple questions here. I don't know. One of them keeps recurring, and this is just a yes or no, Sean, and I know the answer to this one. Is the Earth flat?
Is the Earth flat? Is your mind flat? That's my question.
Thank you. That's what I've always been saying to that.
Or actually, I really want to start a flat sun society, because if the sun is flat, then the Earth might be flat.
You should call it all planets, all stars flat, right? You should call that sort of society.
Look, if the irony, of course, is that if you go far enough out, everything looks flat.
That's true.
In space at a certain place, I'm sure everything looks very flat.
I know. That was one thing I hesitated to ask you, Sean, but it was being persistently asked. Okay, the last question I'm going to ask from the chat, even though there's actually two. Let me see if I can get this one in. It says, I don't know how this is answerable. Do you think your intelligence can compare to an intelligence to one that is a couple million years before you? And I don't know how to quite quantify that or put that, but that's word for word, Sean.
That's the beauty of it. That's exactly the point. That's what I was talking about at the beginning. My reality is only my perception, my experience, my learning. It's only my reality. I can never compare my consciousness even to that of a bat, let alone to you, let alone to someone a million years ago. Consciousness is our experience of reality, right? If I'm a bat, I don't have eyes. I'm listening my way through reality, right? I have a completely different perception of things. If I'm a cat, I see different frequencies. If I'm me, I've grown in this form, but I've also had a soul since who knows how many. When did my soul come into existence? As I said, before Sean Stone, who am I?
That's right. How many lives did you have, or how many other places were you living before? I mean, for instance, before you were Sean Stone, were you a name that was a symbol from a galaxy far, far away, or possibly another dimension? These questions literally go as far as our minds and imaginations can go. And here's the irony, Sean, is that even though it takes us as far as our imaginations can go, really sometimes as far as it can go is what reality ends up being. Anyhow, I want to thank you so much, Sean. It's been a fantastic hour with you. We definitely have to do this again. But before we go, I want to give you time to plug in everything you want to plug in. First of all, tell people where they can see you, where they can hear you, your book, etc.
Absolutely. Well, look, all my work is available on Amazon. Book, New World Order, the documentary History of War, the Greystone Park. Everything is available on Amazon. And just check me out on YouTube. I have a channel at The Real Sean Stone on Instagram. Watching Sean on Twitter. Yeah, basically, just everywhere that you don't want to find people, I suppose. Infinite reality of the internet.
That's true, especially nowadays compared to 20-some years ago. I got to give my thanks to everybody out there. First of all, for all the listeners and all those of you who have been engaging in chat, I want to thank you all for being a part of this show. To my social media manager and also my audiovisual engineer, Miss Pam Brettenberg, also my VP of operations and assistant producer, because I'm the executive producer, of course, Josh Cheris. Also, let's not forget the station owner of UPRN, United Public Radio Network, Joe Montaldo. Now remember, folks, the only thing you have to remember in terms of the show is the name of it, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live, like the website, drjradiolive.com. Every single social media account, for instance, minds.com, which is a Facebook-like type open source site that also pays you in cryptocurrency. BitTube, a YouTube-like site that also pays you in the same way. And everything else in between: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, as I mentioned, YouTube already. You name it, it's all DRJ Radio Live. With that being said, everybody, I want to wish you all a good morning and good day for those of you in England and east of it. And for those of you in the United States, I wish you all a happy or good evening, good night. And now I must say I am officially signing off.
Dun, 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 dun.